As I continue what appears to be my trick question series, my question for you today is, what is NLP? What is it with me and trick questions? I don't know, but for some reason I seem to be fixated on them, and I'm asking you another trick question. And the reason this one is tricky is that one of the co-founders of the field really enjoys providing different and contradictory answers to the question that I have just asked. Because there are, if you ask Richard Bandler what NLP is, he will give you a different answer pretty much every time. And it all essentially equates to, from Mr. Bandler's perspective, it equates to NLP is whatever I decide that it is at the moment, and it isn't whatever I decide it isn't at the moment, which gives him maximum flexibility. And certainly being ridiculously flexible is fundamentally a part of what NLP is. So let's explore, for the sake of argument, what NLP is going to be, so that when we have these discussions, we can have a kind of shared definition for the sake of argument. Now, first of all, let's say that NLP stands for Neuro Linguistic Programming. And that breaks down pretty simply. Neuro is your neurology, that's your brain. Linguistic is your language. But it's not just spoken word, it's any kind of communication. It's the things that we do in order to express ourselves to one another, and to ourselves, really. And the third aspect of this is programming. Now, this comes from a time, especially, when this field emerged out of cybernetics and some other influences like transformational grammar and some other things that came out of the 50s and 60s. By the 1970s, the metaphor of the brain as being like a computer was quite popular. And so neurolinguistic programming was absolutely of the time. Now, of course, things have changed since that time, and we are understanding the limitations of that metaphor. Is the brain like a computer? Well, yes, it's a good metaphor for a brain in some ways, and it's a terrible metaphor for a brain in other ways. But like any metaphor, whenever you say this is like that, there are ways in which that is true, and then there are ways in which that is not true. That is the nature of metaphor. So what we're going to do is that we're going to focus on the ways in which a brain is a bit like a computer. So, for example, you tend to do things in certain patterns. Well, a computer does stuff in patterns too. And those patterns that tell a computer what to do in individual cases are called programs. And so, therefore, we can say that because you tend to do things in a certain order and certain stimuli tend to provoke certain responses, in that way, you're a bit like a computer in that you have some programming that you run in response to certain things. And your neurology processes stuff with language. But language is more than just words. Language is also the ways that we represent things to ourselves and others. So therefore, if I say, I've got to tell you that this is a hot new product and that all the cool kids are going to want it. Well, the heat metaphor there in terms of the product means, this is hot off the presses. It's smoking hot. It's hot out of the oven, right? There's all kinds of ways in which hot suggests that people really want that. Now, when we say that someone is cool, well, it can mean aloof. It can mean that this is someone who's stylish and fashionable. And when someone is stylish and fashionable, very often that suggests a kind of distance. And warmth comes with proximity, but distance suggests coolness, especially when we're talking about people who are operating at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit under normal circumstances. And so therefore we radiate heat. The further, the more separated we are from one another, the less heat we can feel coming off of one another. We huddle together for warmth. We separate and we feel cooler. Well, social distance is not necessarily physical distance, but again, metaphors, right? Your brain uses subjective experience and it's conveyed via metaphor. And these metaphors adjust the way that we feel about things. Now, and the way that you feel about things is generally that kind of feeling is the motivation that then preconsciously and unconsciously prompts action. Action of one kind or another. Could be useful action, could be good, could be not so useful action, could be a bad habit, could be a phobia, could be anxiety. Okay, or it might be being productive. It might be, suddenly launching into being creative. It could be, the thing that tells you that it's time to take action and do something amazing. And therefore, as we learn to adjust our subjective experience in the way that we perceive the world, by changing the way that we communicate with ourselves and by changing the way that we communicate with others, then we can change the triggers, usually feelings caused by certain kinds of representations, which cause us to start using certain programs. And we can do other programs instead. In fact, if you think about these programs as being patterns of behavior, then once you learn to understand the patterns, what prompts it, how is it structured, how do we do this inside of our brain? Not just someone trying to give you a logical cognitive explanation, but how are we really doing it? What's going on under the surface? Then that means that we can think about these programs, these patterns, as a kind of model. We're creating a model of how it is that people do things, which is made up by all of these procedures or patterns. And therefore, NLP, as the study of this subjective experience, becomes a way of doing modeling. Now, there are two kinds of modeling. Well, let's leave the catwalk and the fashion magazines aside for the moment. There are two kinds of this kind of modeling. One is analytical. That's where we go to an exemplar of somebody who does something and we say, how do you do that? And they tell us as best they can how it is that they think that they do what it is that they do. Or we can have an implicit model, which basically says, the exemplar, his or her definition, his or her explanation is superfluous. We want to see what it is that they actually do rather than what they say that they do. Because this is another important point, and I think all of you have seen this in one way or another. People who are amazing at doing something very often are unaware of exactly what they do to do that thing. And in fact, sometimes someone trying to describe to you what it is that they do, they may come up with something that sounds quite plausible, or it may be that it sounds completely implausible, or it may be that they just say, I don't know how it is that I do that. But that's the thing. People don't always really know what's going on inside of their minds. And therefore, if you are able to track unconscious, implicit behaviors that suggest what might be going on in someone's mind, that allows you to extract these programs so that you can take this. You've modeled this experience of what it is that this person does, of this, this exemplar has allowed you to extract a model so that you can then analyze that model, understand the procedures, the programming, and then if you know how to do that, you can then install that programming or transfer that programming, teach that programming to someone else. But of course, you can't do this explicitly because the person who does this doesn't do it explicitly. He does it preconsciously. And therefore, the other person that you're teaching this to, you've got to transfer it in a way so that it becomes instinctive, automatic, and unconscious for them. Does that make some sense? If you think about our educational system, for example, our educational system is dedicated to telling you about things. And through memorization, through rote, through procedure, they are hoping that you will somehow bridge the gap between a cognitive understanding about something and a kind of competence in doing the thing. But I want you to think about any time that you learned how to do something really complex. In fact, I want you to think about something that you do that's quite complex right now. For example, if I asked you the question, do you speak consciously? I think most of you would say, why, yes, Michael, I do. I'm consciously aware of the things that I say. But are you really speaking consciously? Is what you say emanating from conscious behavior? Because if I asked you how you are conjugating your sentences before they say them, where do you put the noun? Where do you put the verb, the adverb? How are you deciding all of this? I think you'd have to say that actually speech is a preconscious behavior. Right now, as I am listening to what I'm saying, I'm learning exactly what it is that I'm going to say as I say it. I don't have a conscious awareness of the full structure of everything that I'm saying before I say it. In fact, if I tried to do that, I would step all over my own feet. That's another metaphor, right? Because, again, if you try to walk consciously, if you try to say, okay, I'm going to put my toes here, I'm going to put my heel here, I'm going to put the ball of my foot there, you're going to be a terrible walker if you try to do everything consciously. You walk at your best when you don't think about it. You speak at your best when you don't think about it. You may think a little bit about what it is that you're going to say in advance, but the actual process of speaking, it's an unconscious process and it emerges into consciousness. And therefore, NLP, one of the reasons why we're talking about NLP on a hypnosis channel is that it does deal with unconscious or preconscious factors and the way that they affect conscious experience, the way that they affect all of our lives. Because most, and this is what we're learning from cognitive neuroscience, most of my behaviors, if not all of them, emerge from preconscious thought. There may be ways in which conscious cognition, adds to that discussion. And then there's the factor of willpower and a couple other things. There may be some overriding factors. But it seems that most of the stuff that's going on that produces the things that you do isn't necessarily coming from what Mr. Freud would have called the conscious mind. So, if you want to change, and you want to change in a powerful way that is, ideally a positive way, and one that is automatic, then you must change preconsciously. You must change at the deepest level. And NLP is about understanding the structure of what goes on, the structure of this programming that takes place at a deeper level of consciousness. Especially in the light of, again, from the world of linguistics, as we've moved on from transformational grammar to the current understanding of embodied cognition, and how all language in its own way is metaphor. This study of subjective experience becomes even more vital and more important. Now, in the days and weeks to come, we'll be going through the kind of, practical stuff that we can do with this understanding of metaphor, cognition, modeling, and all of these things. But for right now, I would just like to leave it with this way of thinking about neurolinguistic programming as the study of subjective experience, a way in which we can understand how that affects the patterns and programming, and as a means of implicit modeling, so that we can take distinctions of how we do things in a problematic way, perhaps, and change them for the better, or how we can take distinctions from exemplars of excellence so that you and I can learn to be more excellent, more easily, in the way that the real masters of certain kinds of behaviors and certain kinds of approaches to life can do so easily. And we can then use the tool sets of NLP and hypnosis and even things like meditation and self-hypnosis to help us to roll that and wrap that into our lives so that we become more and more the people that we are becoming. And as we become more capable, more rational, more emotional in just the right ways, so that we can live a more balanced and more fulfilling and more ecological and sustainable life. So if that sounds like something that you're looking forward to, let's keep this definition in mind as we continue the conversation. Next up, I promise that we're going to be getting more into the practical, but we may have just a few more, slightly more philosophical conversations as well, so that we can make sure that we understand what we're talking about before we get into how you can use your brain for a change, or use your brain for a change. Either one of those is great. And I'm Michael Perez. Thank you so much. My question for you is, what do you think about this definition of NLP? Do you have another definition that you like better, or that you like differently? Is there something that you'd like to add? Any feedback is welcome. Like the video if you like this kind of discussion and want more of it. You can dislike it too if that's your feedback. I'm okay with that as well. And please, if you want more of these and more of this and more of me, please subscribe. Talk with you soon. Be well.